They swore him in as sheriff on the same gallows where they'd hanged the last one. The town of Ridgewood needed law, someone to stand between them and the chaos bleeding from the hills. Marshal Kane arrived with credentials, a steady hand, and eyes that promised justice. For 6 months, Ridgewood thrived. Then a stranger rode in carrying a marshal's badge of his own and a photograph that showed Kane's face on a wanted poster. Some men wear the law like armor. Others wear it like a mask. These lands know pain better than joy. Every mark in the sand tells a story, but folks rarely listen. I saw this tale with my own eyes, like the crackle of a fire at night. The shadows of the past don't leave. You'd best listen close. Out here, it's the only way to survive. Ridgewood sat in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, like a town holding its breath, waiting for the next catastrophe to arrive. The silver mines had played out 3 years back, leaving behind skeletal derricks and men with nothing to do except drink away the memories of better times. What remained was a community of 200 souls, ranchers, storekeepers, widows, children, trying to scratch survival from dust and determination. The previous sheriff, a man named Garrett Cross, had been hanged by the very town he'd sworn to protect. Cross had taken bribes from a gang of rustlers, looked the other way during robberies, and finally shot a man in cold blood over a card game dispute. When the territorial marshal arrived to investigate, he'd found enough evidence to fill a ledger. The hanging was quick, legal, and utterly necessary, but it left Ridgewood without law. Marshal Kane appeared in late September when the aspens were turning gold and the air carried the promise of winter. He rode into town on a black gelding, his posture straight despite obvious trail weariness, his duster coat dusty from hard miles. He was perhaps 40, with a face weathered by sun and carved by experiences that showed in the lines around his eyes. A silver badge gleamed on his chest, Territorial Deputy Marshal, properly commissioned. The town council met him at the livery stable. 5 men, Mayor Douglas Whitmore, a former banker with soft hands and hard ambitions, Thomas Brennan, owner of the general store and unofficial voice of the merchants, Father Miguel Santos, whose church served as both spiritual and community center, Dr. William Chun, whose medical skills kept Ridgewood from succumbing entirely to frontier mortality, and Jacob Morse, the blacksmith whose strength was matched only by his suspicion of outsiders. Marshal Kane, Whitmore said, extending his hand, "Your credentials preceded you. We're grateful the territorial office sent someone so quickly." Kane dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose body remembered old wounds. He shook hands with each council member, his grip firm but not aggressive. Ridgewood's situation was brought to the governor's attention. A town without law becomes a target for every outlaw and drifter looking for easy pickings. "We had law," Morse growled. His blacksmith's arms crossed over his barrel chest. Cross wore the badge for 3 years before we discovered what he really was. "How do we know you're different?" Kane met the blacksmith's challenging stare without flinching. "You don't. Not yet. Trust is earned, not granted. I suggest you watch me closely, question everything I do, and hold me accountable. A lawman who can't stand scrutiny isn't worth the badge he carries." The answer seemed to satisfy Morse, at least partially. Father Santos stepped forward, his weathered face kind despite decades of witnessing frontier hardships. "We've prepared quarters for you at the boarding house. Mrs. Sullivan has a room ready. The sheriff's office is on Main Street. Cross's belongings have been removed." That evening, the town council convened a public meeting in the church. Nearly the entire population attended, packing the pews and standing along the walls. Kane stood before them, his badge catching lamplight, and addressed the assembly with a calm authority that immediately commanded attention. "I know you've been burned before," Kane began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed space. "Sheriff Cross betrayed your trust. That wound won't heal quickly, but I'm not here to replace Cross. I'm here to restore what he corrupted. Law isn't about one man. It's about a compact between a community and the principles that hold civilization together." He paused, letting his words settle. "I'll enforce the law fairly. No bribes. No favoritism. No looking the other way when justice demands action. In return, I ask for your cooperation. Report crimes. Testify honestly. Support the structures that keep chaos at bay. A woman in the third pew stood, Martha Coulter, a widow whose husband had been killed in a mining accident. What about the rustlers? They've been hitting ranches for months. Cross did nothing. Will you? I will, Kane replied simply. Give me 2 weeks to familiarize myself with the territory, identify the gang's patterns, and organize a response. Then we'll address the rustling problem permanently. Over the following weeks, Kane proved as good as his word. He rode the boundaries of Ridgewood's territory, mapping trails and water sources, identifying likely hideouts. He interviewed ranchers, documented losses, and began piecing together the rustlers' methodology. They operated from the foothills, struck at night, and moved stolen cattle through canyon passes toward markets in Colorado. Kane's approach was methodical, patient, professional. He didn't rush into confrontations or make empty promises. When he finally moved against the rustlers, he did so with a posse of 12 men, striking at dawn while the gang was moving a herd through Copper Canyon. The gunfight was brief and decisive. 2 rustlers died, or surrendered. The rest fled into the mountains. Kane recovered nearly 200 head of cattle and returned them to their rightful owners. The town celebrated with a dinner in the church hall, and for the first time since Cross's betrayal, Ridgewood felt like law had returned. But not everyone celebrated. In the corner of the hall, an old prospector named Samuel Pike watched Kane with narrowed eyes. There was something about the marshal's face, something familiar that Pike couldn't quite place. He'd spent 40 years in mining camps and frontier towns, seeing faces come and go like tumbleweeds in the wind. And somewhere, sometime, he'd seen Kane's face before. Pike said nothing that night, but he filed the memory away, waiting for it to connect with whatever truth lay hidden beneath Marshal Kane's carefully constructed persona. Winter arrived hard and early, locking Ridgewood in snow and cold that tested every structure and soul. But under Kane's steady hand, the town weathered the season better than anyone could remember. The marshal organized patrols that prevented theft during the lean months, mediated disputes before they escalated to violence, and even helped distribute supplies to families struggling with food shortages. Kane didn't just enforce law. He became part of Ridgewood's fabric. He attended church services, though he never took communion. He played chess with Dr. Chun on Wednesday evenings. He helped Father Santos repair the church roof, damaged by heavy snow. He taught Mayor Whitmore's teenage son how to shoot straight and handle a revolver safely. The townspeople began to trust him. Women smiled when he passed. Children waved. Men sought his counsel on matters beyond law, business disputes, family troubles, questions about honor and obligation in a world that rarely rewarded either. Sarah Brennan, the daughter of storekeeper Thomas Brennan, found herself particularly drawn to the marshal. She was 23, sharp-minded, and restless in a town that offered few opportunities for women beyond marriage and motherhood. Kane treated her with respect that bordered on equality. He asked her opinion on town matters, discussed books they'd both read, and never patronized her intelligence. "You're different from most lawmen," Sarah told Kane one afternoon as they walked along the creek that ran through town. Spring thaw had turned the water loud and vigorous, and the air carried the scent of wet earth and possibility. "How so?" Kane asked, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. Most men who wear badges are either bullies hiding behind authority or cowards using law to avoid real confrontation. You're neither. You're... She paused, searching for the right word. Deliberate. Like every action you take has been weighed against some internal standard most of us can't see. Kane smiled slightly. "I've seen what happens when law becomes arbitrary. When sheriffs decide justice based on personal preference rather than principle. It creates the kind of chaos that destroys communities." "Were you always like this?" Sarah pressed. "Or did something teach you?" For a moment, Kane's expression shifted. Something dark flickered behind his eyes, a memory or regret that surfaced briefly before he buried it again. "We're all taught by our mistakes, Miss Brennan. The question is whether we learn from them or repeat them. He changed the subject smoothly, asking about her father's store, and Sarah let the deflection pass. But she filed away that moment of vulnerability, that glimpse of whatever Kane kept hidden beneath his carefully maintained composure. By spring, Ridgewood had transformed. Crime had dropped to nearly nothing. Disputes were resolved through Kane's mediation rather than violence. The territorial governor sent a commendation letter praising Kane's work. Neighboring towns began requesting his assistance with their own law enforcement challenges. The town council voted unanimously to make Kane's position permanent. Mayor Whitmore presented him with a new badge, not a territorial appointment, but a town sheriff's star, forged by Jacob Morse himself, with Ridgewood's name engraved on its back. "This town owes you a debt," Whitmore said during the ceremony held in the packed church. "You've given us something we'd lost, faith that law can work, that justice isn't just a word painted on courthouse walls." Kane accepted the badge with visible emotion. He held it for a long moment, studying the metal, the engraving, the weight of expectation it carried. When he spoke, his voice was thick with something that might have been genuine gratitude, or might have been guilt. "I'll wear this with honor," he said simply, "for as long as you'll have me." The crowd erupted in applause. Sarah Brennan, standing in the front pew, watched Kane's face and saw something she couldn't name, a shadow that passed across his features like a cloud blocking the sun. It was there and gone so quickly she wondered if she'd imagined it. But Samuel Pike, standing at the back of the church, saw it too. And unlike Sarah, Pike had finally remembered where he'd seen Kane's face before. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he had to grip the pew to steady himself. That night, Pike rode out of Ridgewood without telling anyone where he was going. He headed east, toward the territorial capital, carrying with him a suspicion that would either confirm Kane as the man he appeared to be or expose him as the most dangerous kind of criminal, the one who wore justice as a disguise. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday morning in late May when the town was busy with spring planting and nobody paid particular attention to another drifter passing through. He was tall and lean, dressed in trail-worn clothes, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat pulled low. A marshal's badge gleamed on his chest, genuine territorial silver that commanded respect. He tied his horse outside the sheriff's office and entered without knocking. Kane looked up from paperwork, his hand instinctively moving toward the revolver on his desk before he recognized the badge. "Marshal, I wasn't expecting a territorial visit. Is there a problem?" The stranger removed his hat, revealing a face perhaps 35 years old, weathered but handsome, with eyes that carried the particular weight of someone who'd seen violence and hadn't looked away. "My name is Marshal Thomas Garrett. And yes, Sheriff Kane, there's a problem. A significant one." Kane's expression didn't change, but something in his posture tightened almost imperceptibly. "What kind of problem?" Garrett reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph, the kind taken in studios, formal and precise. He laid it on Kane's desk. This photograph was taken 8 years ago in a town called Silverton, 300 miles south. Shows a man named Victor Maddox. He was wanted for embezzlement, fraud, and the murder of a business partner. Kane picked up the photograph, studied it with apparent curiosity. The image showed a man perhaps in his early 30s, clean-shaven, dressed in expensive clothes. "What does this have to do with me?" "Look closer, Sheriff. Look at the eyes, the shape of the jaw, the way he holds his shoulders." Garrett leaned forward. Victor Maddox disappeared 8 years ago, right before the territorial marshal arrived to arrest him. Vanished like smoke. Since then, I've been tracking rumors, following trails, piecing together a pattern of a man who reinvents himself every few years. Kane set down the photograph carefully. "You're suggesting I'm this Maddox?" "I'm not suggesting. I'm stating." Garrett pulled out more documents, wanted posters, witness statements, a detailed investigation report. Maddox was brilliant, educated, capable of extraordinary deception. He could walk into a community, earn trust, position himself as a pillar of society, and rob people blind while they thanked him for his service. That's an interesting theory, Marshal Garrett. But theories require evidence, and I see none here that connects me to this criminal. Garrett smiled, a cold expression that carried no warmth. Then you won't object to a formal investigation. I've brought authorization from the territorial governor to examine your background, interview witnesses, and verify your credentials. For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the desk. The office was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall and the distant sounds of Ridgewood going about its morning business. Finally, Kane spoke. "You're welcome to investigate, Marshal Garrett. I have nothing to hide. My credentials are legitimate. My service to Ridgewood speaks for itself. When you're satisfied that I'm not your fugitive, I expect a written apology." Garrett gathered his documents. "We'll see what the investigation reveals, Sheriff. Until then, I suggest you continue your duties as if nothing has changed. The people of Ridgewood deserve stability, regardless of what truths emerge." He left, and Kane sat alone in the office, staring at the photograph on his desk. Slowly, he reached for it, holding it up to the light streaming through the window. The resemblance was undeniable: the eyes, the jawline, the bearing. It could have been him 8 years younger. Or it could have been someone else entirely. Marshal Garrett wasted no time. He established himself at the boarding house and began systematically interviewing every member of the town council, asking detailed questions about Kane's arrival, his background, his methods. The questions were polite but thorough, designed to uncover inconsistencies or unexplained gaps in Kane's story. Mayor Whitmore defended Kane vigorously. The man's credentials were verified by the territorial office. He served this community with distinction. Whatever you think you know about him, I can tell you that his actions here have been exemplary. But Garrett pressed. Did he ever discuss his past? Where he served before Ridgewood? What cases he worked? Any personal history? Whitmore hesitated. No, he keeps his past private. But many lawmen do. The frontier doesn't reward men who dwell on yesterday. The same pattern emerged in other interviews. Kane was respected, even admired. But he'd shared almost nothing about his life before Ridgewood. No stories of previous postings. No mentions of family. No references to old friends or colleagues. He'd arrived fully formed, like a man born the moment he rode into town. Sarah Brennan watched the investigation with growing unease. She sought out Garrett one afternoon, finding him reviewing documents in his boarding house room. "You're destroying a good man's reputation on suspicion," she said without preamble. "Kane has done nothing but serve this town honorably." Garrett looked up from his papers. "Miss Brennan, I understand your loyalty, but consider this. If Kane is innocent, the investigation will prove it and strengthen his standing. If he's guilty, would you want a criminal wearing the badge, even if he's been performing the duties well?" "People can change," Sarah argued. "Even if you're Victor Maddox and our Sheriff Kane were the same person, which I don't believe. Shouldn't 8 years of honest service count for something?" "The law doesn't offer redemption through deception, Miss Brennan. If Maddox committed crimes, he needs to answer for them. Justice delayed is still justice required." Meanwhile, Kane continued his duties with apparent calm. He made his rounds, settled disputes, maintained order. But those who knew him best, Dr. Chun, Father Santos, noticed subtle changes. Kane slept less. He spent more hours alone in the sheriff's office. His chess game became distracted, prone to mistakes he'd never made before. One evening, Dr. Chun confronted him directly. "Whatever Garrett thinks he's discovered, you should tell your side of the story. Silence makes you look guilty." Kane stared out the office window at Ridgewood's main street, where lanterns were being lit against the gathering dusk. "There are some stories, Doctor, that can't be told without destroying everything they touch. Sometimes silence is the only mercy we can offer." "Mercy to whom? Yourself or the people who've come to trust you?" "Both. Neither. I don't know anymore." Kane turned from the window. "If I'm Victor Maddox, and I'm not confirming that I am, then I'm a man who committed terrible crimes. Stole money from people who trusted me. Destroyed lives. Caused a death through my greed and cowardice. The law would demand I hang for what I did." Dr. Chin said nothing, waiting. But if I'm also Marshal Kane, the sheriff continued, then I'm a man who's spent 8 years trying to atone for those crimes, who's protected communities, upheld law, lived honorably even when it cost me comfort and safety. Which man deserves judgment? The one I was or the one I've become? I'm not qualified to answer that question, Dr. Chin replied quietly. But I know this. The people of Ridgewood will have to make that choice. And whatever you've hidden will come to light. Garrett won't stop until he's uncovered the truth. That night, an old prospector returned to Ridgewood. Samuel Pike had ridden to the territorial capital and back, carrying with him documents that would force everyone, Kane, Garrett, the entire town, to confront the question of whether redemption earned through deception could ever be real justice. The letter Samuel Pike had brought back from the territorial capital sat on Esther Chen's desk like a loaded revolver. Dr. Chen had asked to see it after Pike came to him first, knowing the old prospector's discovery would force Ridgewood into an impossible decision. The territorial marshal's records were thorough. Marshal Thomas Garrett had done his investigation well. Birth certificates, employment records, witness statements from Silverton, and photographs, 2 of them, placed side by side. Victor Maddox, 1879. Sheriff Kane, 1887. The same man. Dr. Chen called a town council meeting for that evening. Word spread through Ridgewood faster than wildfire, through dry prairie grass. By the time the sun began its descent, the church was packed again, not with celebration this time, but with tension thick enough to choke on. Kane sat in his office alone, staring at the badge Jacob Morse had forged for him. He'd known this day might come, had lived with that possibility hanging over him like a noose for 8 years. Part of him felt relief that the waiting was finally over. The church doors opened, and Mayor Whitmore entered Kane's office. His face was grave, older than it had been just days before. The council needs you to attend the meeting tonight. Kane looked up slowly. Am I under arrest? Not yet, but Marshal Garrett has presented evidence. The town deserves to hear the truth. From you. Kane stood, his movements deliberate. He removed the sheriff's star from his vest, held it for a long moment, then set it carefully on the desk. I'll tell them everything. The walk to the church felt longer than any Kane had taken. Every face he passed, merchants he'd helped, widows he'd protected, children he'd taught, now looked at him with confusion and betrayal. Sarah Brennan stood outside the general store, her father's hand on her shoulder, tears streaming down her face. Inside the church, silence fell as Kane entered. He walked to the front, standing not in the pulpit, but before it, on the same level as everyone else. Marshal Garrett sat in the front pew, his evidence laid out like accusations made flesh. Kane looked out at the assembled townspeople, faces he'd come to know, lives he'd protected. He saw anger in some expressions, sympathy in others, but mostly confusion. How could the man who'd saved them be the same man who'd destroyed others? My name, Kane began, his voice steady but quiet, was Victor Maddox. 8 years ago, I was a businessman in Silverton. I owned a shipping company with my partner, James Whitfield. We were successful, wealthy, respected. He paused, gathering the words he'd rehearsed 1,000 times, but never spoken aloud. I was also a thief and a fraud. I embezzled from our company, forged documents, stole money from investors who trusted me. When James discovered what I'd done, he threatened to expose me. The church remained silent, every ear straining to hear. So I killed him, made it look like a robbery, took the money I'd stolen, and disappeared the night before the territorial marshal arrived to arrest me. Sarah Brennan's sob cut through the stillness. Kane's eyes found hers, and he saw his worst fear reflected back, disappointment from someone who'd believed in him. For 3 years I ran, changed my name, my appearance, my life, worked as a ranch hand, a mine guard, anything that kept me moving and invisible. I told myself I was surviving, but I was just a coward running from justice. Then 5 years ago, I witnessed something. A family murdered by outlaws in New Mexico. I watched from hiding, did nothing to help them, and when the killers rode away, I stood over the bodies and realized I had become something worse than a thief or even a murderer. I'd become someone who could watch evil happen and do nothing. Kane's voice cracked slightly. That's when I decided to become someone different. Not to erase what I'd done. You can't erase sins. But to balance them. To spend whatever life I had left serving law instead of breaking it. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn journal. For 5 years, I've kept this. Every crime I stopped, every life I saved, every act of justice I performed. Not to justify what I did. Nothing justifies murder, but to prove to myself, and to James Whitfield's memory, that the man I'd become wasn't the man I'd been. Mayor Whitmore stood slowly. The territorial warrant for Victor Maddox's arrest is still active. The crimes you describe, embezzlement, fraud, murder, carry the death penalty. I know, Kane replied simply. But Whitmore continued, his voice strengthening. We're not just talking about legal guilt. We're talking about moral complexity. The man who committed those crimes 8 years ago, is he the same man who saved this town? Father Santos rose from his pew. In the eyes of the law, yes. In the eyes of God. He spread his hands. I believe in redemption, but redemption doesn't erase consequence. Both can be true, that Victor Maddox must answer for his crimes, and that Sheriff Kane has genuinely changed. He should hang, called out voice from the back. William Patterson, whose ranch Kane had saved from rustlers. My cattle were returned because of him, but that doesn't give him the right to escape justice for murder. Sarah pushed to her feet, her face streaked with tears. He taught me that law matters, that we build civilization on principles, not personalities. How can we ignore those principles now just because we like him? Kane felt something crack in his chest. She was right. Of course she was right. He taught her too well. Marshal Garrett stood, his face unreadable. The law is clear. Victor Maddox is wanted for murder. Regardless of what he's done since, the warrant stands. I'm authorized to take him into custody and transport him to Silverton for trial. The murmuring in the church grew louder. Jacob Moore stood, his blacksmith's frame imposing. And what if we don't let you? The room went silent. Garrett's hand moved toward his revolver. Then you'd be obstructing justice. And I'd have to arrest you too. This is wrong, Dr. Chin said quietly. Legally correct, perhaps, but morally wrong. This man has saved lives. He's protected this community. Yes, he committed terrible crimes. But 8 years of genuine service, doesn't that count for anything? Kane raised his hand, silencing the growing argument. Stop. All of you, please. Stop. He turned to Marshal Garrett. You're right. The law is clear. And I won't run again. I won't ask these people to break the law to protect me. That would make everything I've done here meaningless. He looked out at the assembled town. I told you when I arrived that law isn't about one man. It's about principles that hold civilization together. If you protect me from justice, because you like me, you destroy the very foundation I've tried to help you build. Sarah was crying openly now. But it's not fair. Life rarely is, Kane said gently. Justice isn't about fairness. It's about consequences and accountability. I killed a man. That debt must be paid. Whitmore stood again. Is there any legal alternative? Any way for Kane to face justice without? He couldn't finish the sentence. Garrett considered. The warrant says dead or alive. If he comes willingly, testifies honestly, shows genuine remorse, the territorial judge might show leniency. Might commute a death sentence to prison. 20 years, maybe. 20 years. Kane would be nearly 60 when released, if he survived prison that long. But, Garrett continued, that's not my decision. My job is to bring him in. What happens after that is up to the court. Kane picked up the badge from where he'd left it on the pulpit. He held it up to the lamplight, watching it gleam, this symbol of law he'd worn with such complicated pride. Before I go, he said quietly, I need you to understand something. Every choice I've made since becoming Kane was real. The man who protected you, who taught Sarah about justice, who helped build this town, That wasn't a disguise. That was me trying to become the person I should have been all along. He set the badge down. But Sarah's right. Principles matter more than personalities. If you let me walk away, you destroy everything we've built together. The vote, when it came, was agonizing. The town council couldn't decide whether to resist Garrett's arrest or accept it. The debate raged for hours, voices rising and falling like waves against the shore. Finally, it was Sarah who ended it. She stood, her young face aged by the weight of impossible choices. We can't break the law to save him. That's what he taught me. That's what he'd want. Her father tried to pull her down, but she shook him off. But, she continued, we can testify. At his trial, every person he helped, every life he saved, we can tell the court who he became. Maybe it won't change the verdict, but at least they'll know the whole truth. Kane felt tears sting his eyes for the first time in years. Thank you, Sarah. Marshal Garrett stepped forward with iron manacles. Victor Maddox, you're under arrest for the murder of James Whitfield and multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. You have the right to. I waive my rights, Kane interrupted. I'll come willingly. I'll testify honestly, and I'll accept whatever judgment the court decides. As the manacles closed around his wrists, cold iron against skin, Kane looked out at Ridgewood one last time. The church full of people he'd protected, the town he'd helped save, the life he'd built from ashes and guilt. One last thing, he said. The rustlers I caught, there are still a few out there. And there's a land dispute brewing between the Miller and Harrison ranches. You'll need a new sheriff. Someone honest from the beginning. We'll find someone, Whitmore promised, his voice thick with emotion. As Garrett led him toward the door, Kane paused beside Sarah. You're going to do great things. Don't let me make you cynical. The world needs people who still believe in justice. Sarah nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face. The ride to Silverton took 5 days. Kane and Garrett traveled in silence mostly, the marshal keeping professional distance from his prisoner. But on the third night, as they camped under stars that cared nothing for human complications, Garrett finally spoke. For what it's worth, he said, I've arrested a lot of men. Most of them make excuses, blame others, claim they're innocent. You're the first I've ever seen actually take responsibility. Does that matter? Kane asked. To the law? No, the law is the law. Garrett poked at the fire with a stick. But to me, yeah, it matters. They arrived in Silverton on a gray morning that matched Kane's mood. The town was larger than Ridgewood, more established, with brick buildings and paved streets. Kane barely recognized it. 8 years had changed more than just him. The trial began 2 weeks later. The courtroom was packed with people from Silverton who remembered the scandal, people from Ridgewood who'd come to testify, and reporters from as far away as Denver who'd heard about the case. The prosecutor laid out the evidence methodically. Financial records proving embezzlement. Witness statements about the night James Whitfield died. The coroner's report showing Whitfield had been shot in the back. Not the mark of a robbery, but of murder. Kane didn't dispute any of it. He testified for 3 hours, answering every question honestly, explaining his crimes without excusing them. Then the defense, such as it was, began, not to prove Kane innocent, but to demonstrate that redemption, while not exonerating, was real. Witness after witness from Ridgewood took the stand. Mayor Whitmore described how Kane had saved the town from lawlessness. Dr. Chin testified about Kane's integrity and character. Jacob Morse, fighting back tears, explained how Kane had taught his children about honor and duty. And finally, Sarah Brennan. At 23, she was the youngest witness, but her testimony carried weight that numbers and facts couldn't match. Sheriff Kane taught me that justice isn't about revenge or convenience, she said, her voice clear despite her fear. He taught me that law only works when we apply it consistently, even when it hurts, even when it means punishing people we care about. She looked directly at Kane. I don't know if redemption erases guilt, but I know that the man who taught me those lessons was genuinely trying to be better than he'd been. That has to count for something. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts. But before sentencing, the judge, a stern woman named Elizabeth Warren, who'd seen 40 years of frontier justice, spoke directly to Kane. "Mr. Maddox, you committed terrible crimes. You murdered a man who trusted you. You stole from people who believed in you. Under normal circumstances, I would sentence you to hang." She paused. "But these aren't normal circumstances. The testimonies I've heard suggest you spent 8 years genuinely trying to atone. You didn't have to do that. You could have disappeared into Mexico, started over somewhere no one knew your face. Instead, you chose the harder path. The law," she continued, "must punish crime, but it can also recognize genuine transformation. Therefore, I'm sentencing you to 25 years in territorial prison. If you survive that sentence, you'll be released. What you do with that second chance will be your choice." 25 years. Kane felt the weight of it settle over him like a physical burden. He'd be in his 60s when released. If he survived. As they led him from the courtroom in chains, Kane looked back one last time. Sarah stood at the back, Whitmore's hand on her shoulder. She raised her hand, a small wave. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition that even broken people could try to be better. 25 years is a lifetime. Long enough for towns to grow into cities, for children to become parents, for the Wild West to transform into something almost civilized. Long enough for a man to wonder if he'll live to see the other side. Kane. He never went back to calling himself Maddox. Survived territorial prison through sheer stubborn determination. He worked in the quarry, broke rocks under a sun that showed no mercy, and slowly counted days that blurred into weeks, into years. Prison was its own kind of justice. Hard men, harder rules, and the constant awareness that violence could erupt without warning. Kane fought when he had to, kept his head down when he could, and gradually earned a reputation as someone who settled disputes fairly, a strange echo of his time as sheriff. Letters arrived sporadically. Dr. Chun wrote once a year, updating Kane on Ridgewood's progress. The town had grown. A railroad spur had finally arrived. New businesses had opened. Sarah Brennan had gone east to study law, the first woman from Ridgewood to do so. Mayor Whitmore's letters were shorter, but no less meaningful. The new sheriff was competent but uninspiring. Crime had remained low. The land dispute Kane had warned about had been resolved peacefully. Ridgewood endured. Sarah never wrote. Kane understood. Some wounds, even when they heal, leave scars too tender to touch. In his 15th year, Dr. Chen's letter brought news that hit harder than any rock hammer. Mayor Whitmore had passed away. Heart failure, sudden and painless. The funeral had drawn hundreds. He'd been beloved. In his 20th year, Dr. Chen himself stopped writing. Kane learned later that he died in his sleep, having served Ridgewood until his final breath. Time erased the people who'd known him, who'd testified for him, who'd given him the small mercy of recognition rather than just condemnation. But Kane endured, partly because he was stubborn, partly because he'd made a promise to himself, to survive long enough to prove that Judge Warren's faith in redemption wasn't misplaced. He was released on a spring morning in 1912, 62 years old, his hair completely white, his body worn but unbroken. The world he stepped into was barely recognizable. Automobiles rattled down streets where horses had once dominated. Telephone wires crisscrossed the sky. The frontier had closed, and something called modernity had rushed in to fill the void. Kane had saved $400 from prison work. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a train ticket west, back toward the territories that had shaped him. Ridgewood had changed dramatically. The population had tripled. Brick buildings stood where wooden structures had once leaned drunkenly against each other. Electric lights replaced oil lamps. A proper courthouse and jail occupied the site where Kane's old office had stood. He walked the streets like a ghost, recognized by no one. The people who'd known Sheriff Kane were dead or scattered. The town had moved on, as towns do. At the cemetery, Kane found familiar names on stones. Whitmore, Chun, Morse. The people who'd vouched for him, who believed redemption was possible, now rested beneath marble and granite monuments to lives well lived. He stood before their graves for a long time, hat in hand, speaking words only the dead could hear, thanking them, apologizing, promising that their faith hadn't been wasted. "Mr. Maddox?" Kane turned. A woman stood behind him, perhaps in her 40s, dressed in the practical clothing of someone who worked for a living. Her hair was pulled back severely, her face lined by years of study and stress. But her eyes, those gray eyes, he recognized. "Sarah," she nodded. "I thought you might come here." Silence stretched between them, filled with 25 years of absence and complicated emotions neither could fully articulate. "I'm an attorney now," Sarah said finally. "Have my own practice in Denver. Specialize in defending people who've made mistakes but deserve second chances." Kane felt his throat tighten. Because of what you taught me," she interrupted. "That people are more complicated than their worst choices. That redemption is real, even if it's difficult." She stepped closer. "I was angry at you for a long time. Felt betrayed. Used. Like everything you taught me was a lie." Kane nodded. "I don't blame you. But then," Sarah continued, "I started defending people, seeing them at their worst, but also seeing their potential to be better. And I realized what you try to tell us, that accepting responsibility is the first step toward genuine change." She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather journal. "I found this among Dr. Chen's effects. He kept it for you, hoping someday you'd be released." Kane took the journal carefully. It was the one he'd shown the town council, his record of every act of justice performed as Sheriff Kane. "You were real," Sarah said softly. "The lessons you taught, the man you tried to become, that was genuine. Yes, you committed terrible crimes. Yes, you deserve punishment. But you also proved that people can change. And that's a lesson I carry with me every day." For the first time in 25 years, Kane felt something like hope. "What now?" he asked. Sarah smiled, a complicated expression that held both forgiveness and boundaries. "Now you live whatever life you have left. Make it count. Prove that Judge Warren's mercy and this town's testimony weren't wasted." She turned to leave, then paused. "There's a town 200 miles north, small place called Redemption Creek. They're looking for someone to mediate land disputes. The pay is terrible, and you'd essentially be doing what you did here, bringing order without official authority." "Why are you telling me this?" Kane asked. "Because," Sarah replied, "I believe people deserve second chances, and third chances, and as many chances as it takes for them to get it right." She left him standing among the graves, the journal in his hands, and the prospect of another opportunity to prove redemption was more than just a word. Kane stayed in Ridgewood for 3 more days, walking streets that had forgotten him, visiting places that held ghosts of better men than he'd been. On the 4th day, he bought a train ticket north, toward Redemption Creek, toward whatever remained of a life interrupted by consequences and transformed by accountability. As the train pulled away from Ridgewood, Kane opened the journal Sarah had returned. Inside, in his own handwriting, were records of disputes settled, lives saved, justice served. But on the last page, in Dr. Chen's careful script, were words that made Kane's vision blur with tears. "A man is not defined by his worst moment, but by every moment that follows." Sheriff Kane, whoever he truly was, chose to spend his years building rather than destroying. That choice matters more than any badge or name. Kane closed the journal and stared out at the passing landscape. The West he'd known was disappearing, replaced by something more ordered, more civilized, less forgiving of men who existed in moral gray spaces. But perhaps there was still room for a bastard sheriff who'd learned that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a future that honored both the victims you'd created and the person you tried to become. The train carried him north, toward Redemption Creek, toward another chance to prove that broken men could still build something worth building. And somewhere behind him, in a cemetery in Ridgewood, the graves of people who'd believed in complicated justice stood as monuments to the truth that mercy and accountability weren't opposites. They were partners in the difficult work of making broken people whole. See you around, my friend. I've got another story for you.